Hello, I'm Terry Quinn. I'm coming to you live from the Scottish Dementia Research Consortium and Brain Health ARC annual meeting in Edinburgh. But I'm taking a break from the conference to introduce this month's webinar. So this is our combined SDRC, Brain Health ARC and NHS Research Scotland research webinar for May. Now, I know you're here for the speaker, but in usual fashion, I'm going to do a little bit of a roundup of what's happening in the older adult and the dementia space in Scotland. And what I want to do, as I always do, is start with a little bit of housekeeping. Because the conference is on, we're not running our webinars live this month. So they're pre-recorded. That means you can't ask any live questions, but there is some Q&A at the end of the session. Both speakers are very happy for you to approach them if you have questions. We're recording the meeting and it's going to be on our new YouTube channel. Please check out the YouTube channel. It's got all of our content there. For future webinars, just let me know about content that you want featured, and I hope to see you at a future webinar. Here we've got a little screenshot of our YouTube channel. Please do subscribe. All of the content that we've been creating over the last while, all of our webinars, all of our tutorials, all of our meetings are going to feature on the channel. So it really is an excellent resource and I'd highly commend that you have a look at it. Many of you will have joined these webinars before, but for those of you who are new to the webinar, I will just give you a little bit of a background to the series. Last year and in years before, I found myself in a position where I was recording multiple webinars for different organisations, for NHS Research Scotland, for the ARC, for SDRC. I enjoyed recording all of those, but there's so much topic overlap that this year we thought we would share things and we would have some webinars that would be shared across all three groups and some that would be separate. Here are some of the webinars that we've had already, some really fantastic speakers and topics. This month we are diverging a little bit, and for NHS Research Scotland, we have Dr. Jane Mazzoli talking about cardiovascular ageing, and for SDRC and ARC, we have Dr. Catherine Quinn talking about research and its emotional burden. I've heard both of the talks and they're fantastic, and you will enjoy them, I can promise you that. For this session, we have one more webinar next month in June, and that's from Tom Welsh, and he's going to be talking about some of the special interest groups that exist in the dementia and the brain health space, so please do join us for that. And then finally, before we get on to the main event and the main speakers, as I always do, I want to just give you a bit of a roundup of some things that are happening that may be of interest to you. Yeah. The first thing is around NHS Research Scotland. So I'm often asked, what do NHS Research Scotland do? What do the clinical leads do? Well, now you can find out, because we've made this book that introduces the clinical leads for all of the different disciplines and tells you a little bit about what they do. That resource and lots of others are on the NHS Research Scotland website, and I'd commend you to have a look at that. There's lots of great content there. Many of you will be aware of the Dunhill Medical Charity. They were one of the major funders of older adult research in the UK. Well, they've had a name change and a slight vision change. They're now called the Vivenza Foundation. Their focus is still very much older adults, so the area that we're all interested in. If you want to find more about what the Vivenza Foundation are up to, you can go to their website. As a bit of a teaser, I'm potentially planning a joint meeting with them. If you want to know more about that or any of the things I'm talking about, join up to our mailing list. One of the issues when you're working with older adults or people living with dementia is around capacity, consent. All of these really tricky issues are issues that I still struggle with. And I've been doing this for a while. So thankfully, from Cardiff University, there is some training resources available. They've been made by the excellent Victoria Shepherd, who works in this area. The URLs are there. I've had a look at them. I think they're really, really useful. And if you're involved in research with older adults or research with people living with dementia, you should really have a look at that. One of the things that we really don't like when we're looking after older adults or people living with brain health issues are anticholinergic medications. We think they're probably bad, but there are lots of unanswered questions. So University of Aberdeen are taking this on, and they are creating a collective that they're calling Archive, another ARC. If you want to know more about what archive are planning, or if you want to be involved, they have a launch event later in the month. There's a QR code there if you want to join them. One of the major clinical journals for all things related to older adults and brain health is Age and Aging. I have the privilege of being on the editorial board of Age and Aging, and Age and Aging are looking for fellows to join. So these are people earlier in their career who want to find out about how journals work, to find out about things like peer review, editorial decisions, commissioning articles. If all of these things are interested to you, please do apply to become an editorial fellow. I looked after the editorial fellows for the last couple of years, and it was good fun. I learned a lot, and I think they learned a lot, and I would really recommend getting involved. Again, there's a QR code there if that's of interest to you. And then finally, but by no means least, in the Brain Health Arc, we are running a priority setting exercise around research questions. We want to know what you think are the most important research questions around dementia, around brain health. If you have things that you think would be useful research questions, then let us know about them. There's a QR code there. Please scan that, add in all of your questions, and we'll collate them. And what we're hoping to do later in the year is create a top 10 list of what we think are the most important research questions in the area. And with that, you'll be pleased to hear I'm going to stop talking. So we'll move now on to the main speaker. Please enjoy their talk, and I hope to see you at a future webinar. Thanks. You've had your summary of what's happening in Scotland. What we're going to move on to now is the main event and our invited speaker, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Catherine Quinn, who is Associate Professor at the Centre for Applied Dementia Studies and the Faculty of Health Studies in the University of Bradford. Now, I met Catherine back in the days when we had Cochrane Dementia, because she was one of our editors in that group, but I've always been really impressed by her work, and I think she's got a lot to share with us that, I think is going to really resonate with people that are part of our Brain Health Arc community. Catherine has lots of interest in a really impressive CV. If you look up her bio on the university website, she's got interest in post-diagnostic support in young dementia. She's the co-PI on a big study called Dynamic of young onset dementia, and co-PI on a number of other trials and cohorts. So I don't want to steal her thunder any more than that, other than to say I'm really looking forward to this talk, because for this talk we are not going out live. There won't be the opportunity to have Q&A with Catherine at the end, but what I'll do is I'll ask a couple of questions from my point, and Catherine has very kindly shared some of her contact details, so if there are pressing issues that you want to ask her about, then you can contact her direct. Okay, so Catherine, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, Terry. I'm just going to share my slides. Okay, so thank you for that introduction. My name is Dr. Catherine Quinn, and I'm an Associate Professor at the Centre for Applied Dementia Studies at the University of Bradford, where I have a role that involves research, and I also do teaching around post-diagnostic support on our Masters in Advanced Dementia Studies and on our PG Cert. Today, I'm going to talk about a piece of work that I undertook that focuses on emotional labour in dementia research. Although the focus of my talk is very much on dementia research, the topic of emotional labour is very applicable to many other types of research as well, particularly around health research. I'll talk to you about where the concept came from. This is a piece of work that I undertook with my colleagues Alex Hillman, Anna Barbosa and Jill Toms. Just to give you a bit of background, this work came about through conversations with myself and Alex Hillman around our own experiences of undertaking research and some of the challenges we faced. And we were aware that there was some lack of conversations around these sort of topics happening. And bringing in some other colleagues, we decided to work on a paper that focused on this topic area. This piece it's unfunded, but it was something that we felt was important to share with others and to get conversations and get people thinking about this issue around emotional labour. So just to say right at the start, this piece of work has now been published. Finally, it was published in Qualitative Health Research. Just because it's published in it's a qualitative and health research journal, I would also say it's applicable to other research methodologies as well. But this is where we found a home for it, and you can find the full paper here. Today, in my talk, I'm going to give you a summary of the main issues that we focused upon in the paper. So my presentation, I'm going to give you an overview of emotional labour and research. I'm going to then draw on examples from research experience. These are examples from my colleagues' experiences. So I apologise that some of my slides might be a bit wordy, but it's their experiences that I'm sharing. And then I'll finish off by giving you some recommendations for how to manage emotional labour. So I've talked about it quite a bit. What is emotional labour? The concept comes from workplace. So it refers to the management of emotions within the workplace. So what the concept recognises that within some work roles, workers need to regulate their emotions during their work encounters. So imagine that you work in a shop and you're customer facing role and you're currently dealing with a customer that's getting very angry and very annoyed. Now, as part of your job role, you must have professionalism. You're supposed to stay calm in response to that behaviour. But internally, you may be feeling very different. You may be getting annoyed with the customer. You may be getting upset, getting anxious. But externally, it's part of your job role is to take on board that behaviour and to try and remain calm. So this applies to many different job roles. It can apply to being anywhere where you've got direct contact with people. So, health professionals, social care professionals. We were particularly interested in applying this concept to research. The concept of emotional labour distinguishes between, as I described in my example, the emotions that are internally felt and the emotions that are externally displayed, and that there can be a disconnect between the two. There can be two different levels of acting involved in emotional labour, such as surface acting, which just means displaying the correct emotion, so just smiling. But there is also deep acting, which actually involves the person changing their internal feelings to display the emotion that best facilitates the situation. So this involves a bit more work involved in terms of changing your emotions. And as I say, this is all about interactions with people, and that it's your job role that affects how you respond to what's happening. So why is it important to talk about emotional labour and research? Why did we write this paper? My feeling is that it's because we don't talk about it in research. It's not something that people commonly talk about. When I was doing the background reading for the paper, I came across some writing that talked about the fact that it might be perceived as being unprofessional to talk about feeling emotional because of the research that you're undertaking. I would very much disagree. I think emotions are very much involved in a part of our working with people, building rapport, etc. But I think there can be this feeling that as researchers, or we should be scientists, we should be detracted from what we're doing. And, it's not, the displaying of emotions might be seen as being unprofessional. I also think, particularly when we're doing research, we tend to fill in ethics forms. In ethics forms, we tend to focus on risk to participants. We do think a bit about our risk to ourselves in terms of personal safety, lone worker policies and things like that, but I'm not sure we're really focusing on the emotional impact of undertaking research on ourselves as researchers. I think by the nature of doing research, we often do also feel under pressure to collect data, and this affects how our research practices occur. So we might be having to collect lots of data within a day. We might be feeling under pressure that we've got to put in lots of visits with participants to get that data collected, or to collect data as quickly as possible by having very short visits. And this can affect how we deal with any of the emotional impacts of undertaking research. It's important to talk about emotional labour because it can have an impact on our well-being. It lingers. It can have short-term impacts and it can have long-term impacts. The image on the slide here, this is the image of the Runcorn Widnes Bridge, which is something I'm very familiar with because it's where an area of where I grew up in. I used to go and visit a lady with dementia who lived alone, and she used to have an image of the Runcorn Widnes Bridge on the wall. And it was something we often talked about. It was an opportunity for us to build rapport. And when I was visiting this lady, because she lived alone, I often arranged the visits with her daughter. And on the last visit with this lady, I hadn't arranged the visit via her daughter, and I just turned up there, and the lady didn't recognize me the way she used to do. We didn't have that same level of interaction. The idea of us talking about this picture, it wasn't there. And I was quite saddened by this, and I realized that what happened was the fact that because I hadn't arranged it via her daughter hadn't reminded her about who I was and why I was there. And it just affected that encounter a bit. And I mentioned this because the long-term impacts, that was probably a decade ago that I did this data collection, but I still remember this encounter and feeling quite saddened afterwards. But of course, during that encounter, I had to remain my professional self, and I'm not sure it was bothering me that she didn't recognize me the way that she had done before. So when can emotional labour occur in research? Well, I'm talking particularly about interactions with participants. This could be face-to-face interactions, but as we move into remote data collection, it can also be through interactions where you're on the telephone, or whether you're collecting data over the computer via Teams, for example. It can occur in different types of data. I probably will focus more on qualitative in my talk, but it can also occur when you're collecting quantitative data, administrating standardized measures. The mini mental state exam is not something I particularly like administering because I found it very difficult because you're sitting there, the person may not be doing very well. And internally, I feel that for that person, I feel for them because they're not, but externally, I'm displaying the emotions of, smiling, trying to encourage them to continue to complete that test. But it just gives you an example of when administering quantitative measures can trigger emotional labour. It can also occur in studies when you're doing observational research, where maybe you're immersing yourself in environments and observing what's going on. I did a lot of work doing observational work in care homes, for example. It was difficult at times. It may be more risk of triggering emotional labour when you're exploring sensitive topics. Today, I'm particularly focusing on dementia, but there are other sensitive health topics that you might be working on where it might be more because of the topic area. It's more likely to trigger emotional labour. And I think that's particularly because one of the issues is that situations can be unpredictable when you're collecting research, no matter how much you are preparing to collect research data. Situations can be very unpredictable when you're interacting with people. This might be because if the participant gets upset, it can affect you. It's very difficult to deal with somebody who's getting upset and not be bothered by this. And I'll talk about this in more detail in the example I'm going to give. But you may also feel angry or annoyed with participants. It does happen. Sometimes you're in situations where maybe they say something or there's something happening where it's bothering you, but you can't display that emotion or feel that you can display that emotion. A key aspect of research is rapport building, and it can be really hard to maintain boundaries. I gave my example before about the lady I used to visit where I kind of built a bit of a friendship with her, but there are other areas where boundaries can start getting blurred, and particularly this may be if you've come from a health or social care background and you're undertaking research, because sometimes it can be difficult to marry off your job role from your research role, and particularly this is where you can get this sort of blurring of boundaries. Another thing that might occur, and particularly with thinking about emotional labour, is that what you're researching or encountering might relate to your own personal experiences. Very often people get involved in dementia research because they have personal experiences of dementia. There may also be things going on in your life at that time that get triggered through doing data collection. When you're talking to somebody about a topic, perhaps you've recently had a bereavement or suffering from ill health yourself. It just may be that you're talking about things in that research encounter that are triggering for you. I'm now going to move on to giving you some examples of when emotional labour has occurred. And as I said at the start, this is drawing on my experiences of my colleagues. So one of the common forms of data collection we do is interviewing. And interviews often produce a variety of fluctuating emotional responses. When we design our interview protocols, we really think through the types of questions we're asking, we think through what might be the reactions, but we never quite know what we might trigger, and we never quite know what sort of answers we may get. And particularly when thinking about dementia, these fluctuations in emotion can be a bit less predictable because they may be triggering memories that we're not necessarily meaning to trigger, but it's the nature of the questions that we ask. And I think that this unpredictability of emotional response can be a bit unnerving because you're not knowing how you might inadvertently cause distress. Sometimes it just happens, and it's not the purpose of the question, but it's how they're responding to it that triggers other memories for them. And because you're directly interacting with that person there and then, you need to be alert to changes and navigate the best way to respond. You're there, you have to deal with that issue in that moment. And this is what can trigger emotional labour on behalf of a researcher. So This is an example from my colleague, and she was undertaking research where she was asking people about that she was around their social networks, so around people that we knew. And in the situation, it was Fred and Maggie, and they'd lost their son in an accident when he was in his 20s. Now, that wasn't the purpose of the interview, but it came up during the interview when he was talking about his previous job. Fred began to describe the tragic event and became tearful and distressed. So as a researcher, my colleague suggested, as we all know, take a break from the interview. She paused the recording, she handed him a tissue, she went to get him a glass of water and sit quietly. And then asked, as we would do, under ethical reasons, do they want to continue? And of course he wanted to continue. And although we started the interview, the sudden recounting of this tragic event left a mark. It kind of carried on throughout that interview. And although she tried her best to end the interview with Fred on a more positive note, focusing on more positive topics and moving that conversation on, that negative emotion that she triggered seemed to stay with him, and it lingered with him. And as a researcher, she felt guilty that this conversation had triggered it. As I said, it wasn't the purpose of the interview to bring out this story, but it came out and it affected him for the rest of the interview. And it's that feeling of guilt that we've triggered something. And it's about how we manage that in that moment. This is another example from a similar piece of data collection that she was undertaking. She was talking to Judith and her daughter. And again, this is around people's social networks. And Judith was very talkative about her life. But when she was talking about when her children were young, she began to talk about her ex-husband, who she had described as a cruel man. And although he'd passed away, as Judith began to talk about him, her memories became a bit blurred, and she started to become agitated and angry because she started to talk about him as he was a present in her life now, that he was still alive. And although the researcher tried to change track, she tried to change the conversation and focus on something different, it became difficult. And Judith became more distressed as she started focusing on this topic. So the research did, as we all do, which, to suggested that we take a break. But again, as with the previous example, that feeling of anger seemed to permeate the rest of the encounter and had to be carefully negotiated in the remainder of that interview. So again, through doing an interview, we triggered a conversation about a topic that has affected that person emotionally. We've tried to, as a researcher, we try and manage it. But we can see here that, again, we've triggered a negative emotion and it's carried on throughout that interview. And as my colleague reflected, it's that feeling of anxiousness that we've triggered something. The emotional labour involved is the fact that although we're internally feeling anxious, we've still got to present ourselves as calm and control in that situation. It obviously was triggering feelings of the fact that we've triggered distress in that person. And now that distress seemed to linger, that we couldn't get it away, even though we moved the conversation on. This anxiousness and worry about how to navigate these emotions. How do we deal with this in this situation? We've got to acknowledge and to provide support, but we also want to try and move that conversation on because we're trying to move them off that topic to focus on something positive, because we're always trying to finish research encounters on a positive note. And that afterwards, I talked before about this sort of short-term and long-term effects on well-being, but this afterwards, this uncertainty and remaining questions, could the researcher have managed the distress differently? Could it have been avoided? And these questions and worry can stay with you for some time afterwards, this lingering afterwards about how they managed the situation. I'll now move on to talk about another type of encounter that can occur that can trigger emotional labour. And very commonly with dementia research, and often in research and other health conditions as well, you're often working with dyads. So often when working with a person with dementia, there's very often a supporter or somebody involved with them in a caring role. This may be a family member, friend, or it may be somebody in a paid role. But we're often dealing with dyads, and it's how we manage these dyads as a researcher, because we're often very much in the middle of these situations. And I'll talk through an example of that my friend Jill encountered in doing her research. And this is around this power to veto within research. And Jill was undertaking a research study. This was actually a trial And the inclusion criteria was that we had to recruit dyads. So both the person with dementia and carer had to agree to take part. And what she encountered was instances when one party wanted to take part and the other person didn't. And she reflected that very often this would be that she'd have a conversation with the carer on the phone. The carer would agree to her coming over to do a consent visit. And when she got there, the person with dementia was less keen to take part. So it's a difficult situation because you've got one person who's keen to take part in the research study, the other person isn't. And for them to take part in the study, both people have to agree. There's a need there to try and manage one person's, here I'm talking about spouse and partner because this is who we're recruiting to take part in the study. Their disappointment about the fact that the other person doesn't want to take part, but also trying to validate the viewpoint of the other person. And as a researcher, we're very keen. We want people to take part in research. We are trying to recruit. So it was sharing that disappointment of the person who wanted to take part in the study, but also needing to be careful that she didn't fall into the trap of trying to persuade the other person to change their mind. You know, we've got somebody who's clearly saying that they don't want to take part in the research study, and we've got to be very careful that we're not trying to convince them to take part, because if they've stated they don't want to. And the terms of that emotional labour, as the image there is that researcher, you end up sort of trying to be in a bit of a peace negotiation role, because you're kind of in the middle of a situation where somebody wants to take part, somebody doesn't. You can't let them take part in the study if they both don't. And it's not nice knowing that your project is going to be a source of contention for at least a little while. You're causing a bit of an argument between them, and it's a difficult situation to be in. And again, it's a situation you're having to deal with there and then, because you're interacting with participants, or people wanting to take part in research. Another instance that can come up when working with dyads is dealing with power dynamics in the conversation. And again, this is quite common working with people with dementia, where you can be working with people with dementia and family members and friends who are there. And there are instances where the partners or spouses or other types of carers are there, have fallen into a pattern of talking as if the person with dementia is not present. So when you're interacting with them, they are taking over the conversation. They may be saying things, and this has happened to me, because they don't think the person can understand what they're saying. And they may be saying things that maybe as a researcher you find a bit upsetting, because you can see the person is sitting there. There can also be instances where some carers in that role can dominate the conversation. I've certainly been out doing data collection where actually it's the person with dementia I'm doing the data collection with, but because the carer is sitting there, they've started to interject into the data collection. And this can occur in interviews. This can also occur if you're administrating standard measures, for example, and a person with dementia is not given the correct answer. The carer starts to step in, and you're having to negotiate that in a situation. You're having to say that, you're validating the carer's viewpoint, but you're also trying to say to them that it's actually the person with dementia's perspective that you're interested in. Or you're trying to manage situations where the carer is dominating the conversation. And there's an emotional labour involved in trying to manage those negative feelings and frustration that you're feeling internally that this can elicit, and both in the moment and afterwards. And again, there's an image here of the pouring of cold water here. And it's this kind of thing, again, about having, as a researcher, you're in a situation where you're trying to calm down the situation to manage it. And it can often evoke feelings of helplessness, because you're kind of trying to deal with it in a situation, but it's hard to know the best way to deal with it. And in this situation, my colleague talks about being worried about the dad and the relationship, because you could see that there was some friction there. But it was not within my gift or role to offer support. There's a limit to how much we can do as researchers. We obviously, as part of the research process, can offer people support, but it's difficult to navigate these kind of relationship or other types of dynamics that are occurring in the situation. So I've given some examples about how emotional labour can occur in research and the sort of emotions that it can trigger. But how can we best try and help ourselves to deal with it? So these are some recommendations that myself and my colleagues came up. They are peer-reviewed recommendations. We've got other people to look at them and give us feedback. So what we've tried to do is think about the different stages of the research process and how you might try and prepare to deal with emotional labour. And the first thing is to prepare for it to happen. So right at the start of your project, when planning it, think about the fact that if you're doing direct interaction with participants, it's likely to happen. Talk about it. Speak to other people about their experiences, particularly if you're new to research. If you're not used to undertaking research before, talk to other people about their experiences about undertaking research. When designing a project, consider about when it might occur. Whereabouts in these encounters might it occur? What are you going to be talking to people about? Think it through. Talk through what if scenarios. A real common example I always give to people is, doesn't matter what the research I'm doing, if it's about dementia, I'm very commonly going to be asked about what are the causes of dementia? What's the time scale? And those sorts of questions. And dementia is a very complicated condition. But you're likely to be asked those sorts of questions because very often people have very limited contact with help and advice from others. And if a researcher is sitting there, we're often seen as a good source of information. So think about the types of questions you might ask and think about how you might respond, particularly if you're being asked about the trajectory of dementia. What's the most appropriate way to be responding to those types of questions that isn't going to cause distress? Also think through about where you can signpost people for support if you don't know the answer, or think about what you could bring with you that might offer help and advice to somebody who's asking questions to you. Where could they go? Think about the boundary of your role, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. But also plan for data collection. I talked right at the start about the pressure that we might feel to undertake data collection, but don't cram too much in a day. Don't be planning 3 visits. Think about that, because if it's triggering emotional labor and then you've got to go to the next person, what are you carrying with you into the next research encounter? Allow time for debriefs, that you can have a break, have time to switch off. Somebody gave me some really good advice, which is don't plan to do data collection at the last minute on a Friday, for example, because you're going to carry those emotions with you all through the weekend, and you do think about things afterwards. So think sensibly about planning for data collection. During that research encounter, I talked about this before, but being in the right headspace, is this the best day for you to be collecting data? Have you had something that happened that morning? Have you had a bereavement? Is something that's happened that might be affecting you emotionally? Are you in that right headspace to be doing this? Manage expectations about your role as a researcher. I just talked before about the fact you may get asked for advice about dementia. Be very clear to somebody about, that you are a researcher and what your role is, and that most of us, maybe you are, but you're not a health professional, you're not a social care professional. If you don't have that background, make sure it's clear to somebody so you're not being asked advice that's above the level in which you can give. But also be careful about, I talked about this, the blurring of boundaries. So if you do have a healthcare or social care background, but you're undertaking research, just watch that those roles aren't starting to get blurred where you feel that you're having to step into your work role a bit more. There's many sort of research papers about that where it can cause sort of distress and discomfort for individuals. Be prepared to deal with family dynamics. I gave you that example about dealing with dyads. It happens particularly with, I'd say, my experience of doing dementia research. You often are encountering working with dyads. If you're getting distressed, think about taking a break. Think about changing the conversation. I say here drinking some water, because that's picking up a glass and having a sip of water gives you a couple of seconds off just to give you that break. You may also think about suggesting you have a toilet break. It's just some way of you managing it in that moment if you're starting to think that this is affecting you emotionally. If you are feeling really uncomfortable in that encounter, we often talk about making sure the participant has a break, that we stop it for them. Also think about it as yourself as a researcher. Do you need to curtail the research encounter and come back another time and rearrange it? It's just about, thinking all these things through so when they happen, you can think about how you might deal with it. And after that research encounter, I talked before about planning, not trying to put too many visits in one day. Take time to reflect afterwards. Give yourself some break to think through that research encounter. Think about debriefing. Obviously, there's ethics in terms of what you can discuss with other people, but you might be able to talk more broadly about that encounter without sharing any sort of identifiable or personal information. If you're a PhD student, this could be talking through with your supervisor, or it could be talking through with a colleague. You may also want to set up a mutual support group, and it's because, just sharing your experiences with other researchers, talking things through, it gets it off your mind and helps you talk things through. Some people find that writing reflective notes may help. This is often part of when we do qualitative research, but it may help you just to write down your own notes and getting it written down about your experiences in that research encounter. And my last point is try to learn from any issues that have occurred. You know, is there some learning that you carry on to the next research encounter? But I also am going to say it's really important to think about the fact that research is often very unpredictable. From the examples I gave, you never quite know what you're going to trigger. You never quite, and sometimes you respond really well in a situation, and sometimes things just don't go so well. And it's important not to blame yourself, because you are dealing with things in the situation and you can prepare as much as possible. But sometimes things happen and it just isn't a good encounter. And I think it's important to recognize that, to learn from it, but not to blame yourself too much, because we're all trying to do our best in these situations. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I just want to acknowledge all those people who helped with the paper, and particularly those individuals who gave that peer feedback on those recommendations that I've just been talking through in the presentation today. So thank you very much. I will now stop sharing my slides.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. I mean, certainly I recognised all of the situations that you were outlining there, and I'm pretty sure all of the people listening in will as well. And what I really liked, within the ARC, the audiences that we have are mixed, and we'll have people who are just researchers, people who combine research with clinical roles, people who are maybe more in a clinical role, people who are in a policy role. But actually, what you've been sharing, I think, will align with experiences that people in all of those different roles have. What I wanted to do with this talk, and what you did really, really beautifully, was you've normalized this, because I know a lot of people, I mean, I think everyone to an extent experiences these emotions and experiences emotional labor, but some people really see that as a weakness in themselves as a researcher. And I experience it, you experience it, we've been doing this for a while and we still experience it. It is a normal part of the research experience.
Yeah, and that's really why we wrote the paper, was because we felt that we'd got to that, I suppose, our stages in our career where we're encountering this, and it's important to share with others that this can occur in research, and that we should just be talking about it more. It's not being unprofessional, that it happens, but if we don't share and talk about it, then obviously we're not letting other people know about it. And I think it's just about upskilling people and enabling them to be empowered, so that if it does occur, that they are prepared for the fact that it may occur in research encounters.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And I want to pick up on something that you raised in that response there, and that you raised through the whole talk, and it's about the importance of talking and sharing. And I want to just recognise that I think that's more difficult now, just in the way that people work, because people will often be working from home. They'll often be doing a lot of research, on a video platform like this, and that opportunity just to be, in the room with colleagues and to informally talk, I think those opportunities are less and less. So something that I've been trying to do, and Catherine, you can tell me your thoughts, is I've been trying to deliberately create the opportunities to allow people to talk about things, not to mandate it. It's not top down. This is a session where you have to start sharing with me, but just, try and deliberately create those opportunities where people get together, and, it is a space to share. I don't know what your thoughts are, Catherine.
I think it's really important. I mean, when I did my PhD a long time ago, I was very much, I had my supervisors to support me, but I didn't have a research community surrounding me. And so there wasn't necessarily that support network that I can draw on now. So as somebody who leads projects, etc., then I, or supports PhD students, I think it's really important that we foster those environments where we can have those conversations. And I think it's also encouraging others that there is this remote working and there is this changing, but really important, particularly for starting off in your research career, build your communities.
Yeah.
Build that support network in, particularly even for any stage of doing research. But it's so important to do that. And I think it's also about those of us who've been in research for longer, ensuring that when we're working with individuals, that we're making sure there's opportunities to talk through the fact that, these research encounters and the emotional impact, and enabling those conversations to happen, because it's ensuring that people feel properly supported afterwards, particularly as I said, that sort of long-term impact. I can tell you all the stories of the research encounters that I felt were quite negative, that I didn't think happened. They are still with me now. I can remember some of the positives, but those ones that didn't work still linger with me now. And I think just enabling to build those communities around you, find your ways, network with people, find opportunities to talk to other people, particularly about your research, is so important.
No, it's so true. And I equally can think of experiences that, have really stayed with me. And, if in the spirit of sharing and talking, if I'm honest, I didn't talk about them at the time, and I probably should have. And it's only as I've felt more mature and more safe as a researcher that I felt able to go back and say, well, let me tell you about this thing, because it's still on my mind. And that has helped me deal with that.
And I think that we often think about safeguarding. Obviously, when we do research, I think, we think about safeguarding. So there are certainly conversations where people have with us where we know that it triggers the need to seek out more support. Maybe they've said something that causes concern, but it's so there's a process for that, particularly when we think about ethics. But there isn't necessarily, we don't always think about a process where it's just things that just kind of bother us or have upset us, or it's just that sort of lower level where there isn't that standardized process where we may not think about talking through other people. But I would really emphasize in this talk that I've been doing now, I found it so much better to just have conversations with people afterwards.
And actually, you've touched on one of the things that I was going to raise. So one of the other hats that I wear is I look after ethics here in University of Glasgow, and we spend so much time and we fret about protecting the participant, and we need to make sure there's lots of signposting if they get distressed, and there have to be SOPs if they get distressed. And as you were talking, I was thinking we don't do any of that for the researcher, and particularly for big research teams. I wonder if actually in our guidance we should ask people as they start to think about the ethics of their research, whether they should also think about how they're going to look after their teams if they get distressed. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I think it's important because I think that's a lot of we are influenced by ethics processes, and as you say, from my experience of undertaking them, when you think about ethical issues, you often are thinking about risk of distress to participant or safety risks to the researcher. And I do think that it's important to consider, and it's not about having a standardized procedure, but as we just talked before about the fact that it's important to have those opportunities to talk with others, even just kind of, if you're leading a large research project, are you enabling your staff to have that opportunity to talk to others? Are you enabling to have debrief? Are you enabling data collection to occur where actually there's breaks for people that they're not doing 3 or 4 visits in a day with different participants, to think that through. And I think it's something I make sure I add to ethical documents now and put it in. But I suppose it's just something that making people think about it, because it's about how we design projects. Obviously, there's the issue about how you deal with it in the moment, and we can try and help people to prepare for this and talk through what are you going to be talking about, or what questionnaires are you going to be administering, what might this trigger. And it's just enabling to have those conversations. So people, or again, as I gave that example, when you've got a trial where you've got inclusion criteria, where you may be turning up and saying, actually, you don't meet that inclusion criteria, your dementia is too severe. You wouldn't say that specifically, but we have cutoffs, in terms of cognitive function. Those are really difficult things to navigate when you've got somebody who's really keen to take part, but you're having to say, you know what, you don't meet our inclusion criteria. And I think things like that could be thought through in terms of preparing researchers on how to deal with it.
Yeah, no, I'm so true. And I want to, just as a last point, we can prepare to an extent, but the nature of research is unpredictable. And one of the things I really liked from your talk was just that very practical tip about taking a glass of water, just to kind of break the rhythm of the interaction and allow you to reset. And I wonder if you have any other little tips that you've picked up over the years, if a research encounter is maybe starting to go the wrong way, how you pause and redirect it.
I mean, sometimes when I've gone to I think it's, to be honest, it's more, I think it's more difficult now when people are doing remote data collection, because I think that's becoming increasingly popular, but I think it creates there's a lot of challenges, particularly if you're doing it over the phone or you can't see that person, because what you can't see is their emotional response to what you're asking them. So there are some additional challenges to use of those techniques. If it's face to face, if I've gone to somebody's home, I often probably spend a bit of time before I start the research. I suppose I spend a bit of time sort of familiarizing myself with the environment. I may look to see whether they've got a dog or an animal or a painting. Is there something I can talk to them about?
Yeah.
Is there something that before, I could flip the conversation to get it off? And so I often think a little bit around that. If I need to shift the conversation over, I'm often very much looking out for cues, any signs or indicators that the person isn't happy. There's something, but I do think allowing yourself a little bit of time to familiarize yourself and to have a bit, again, it comes down to planning, to have a little longer research counter, so there's a bit more time at the start to familiarize yourself, particularly face to face there, so you have got things you can talk to them about. If you need to switch off, maybe there's a painting or a picture of a family member, maybe they've got a nice garden. If you need to take them off the topic area, and as I say, just if you think that it's important, I think that's so important. But again, it comes down to how we design research projects and enabling people that time to do that sort of side of things to begin with.
I know it's so true, and you giving yourself that time. And I think one of the other really important things that I would want to stress as well for the people that are listening in is we're in a place now where there's a perception we have to work harder, we have to get 4 interviews today, and that's not always time efficient because of the emotional labor that comes with that. So, I think particularly when you're working with people who are in a vulnerable situation or who might bring up topics that are emotional for you, allow yourself the time to clear your head between one encounter and another, and just reset and get ready for the next one.
Yeah,
Talking about time. Sorry.
I'll just give it.
Yeah.
I was just going to finish off by just saying I did a lot of work in care homes, and I always used to make sure I walked to the train station afterwards, because it was always that walk afterward. If I'd driven straight away, it would have been all in my head, but I always used to give myself that break, just to give myself that space afterwards before I set off to the next place.
Yeah. So I was just going to say, talking about time, believe it or not, we're now at the hour.
Yeah.
So, Catherine, thank you so much. I've learned a lot from that. I'm sure everyone listening in has also learned a lot. We're going to break now. Thanks everyone for listening. This is part of our series of webinars for the Brain Health Arc. We're planning on having one more this year. And just as a reminder, this talk and all of the other talks are available on our website. Thanks, Catherine, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you.
Bye for now.